So they're making allegories towards, oh God. See, this is a hell of a question. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to talk through how the nature of production and the organization of production at the societal level matches that of the personal or the unconscious. So when they're talking about the paranoid this or the perverted that, it's more of a, think of it as a wry word play, as they were talking about paranoiac machines or perverted machines, or those issues that a person may have. They've become a pervert or a neurotic or this or that. Think of it that direction when they make these wry comments. This is how I interpret it. So when they say things like the perverted townspeople, or I think they say that's the phrasing. The people in the town, the perverts who are as sort of living in the same place that a perverse machine would be, the way that their desire operates, the way that they work within the creation of the body without organs at large, the socius, and how they sort of constantly are heading towards those things or trying to sort of overindulge those. That's the sort of allegory they're playing with. It's a great question, actually, and I wish more people were here to answer. Where the fuck is everyone?
Or else it would be a really quiet session.
It could be a good one. You never know. Do either of you happen to know exactly where I left off last week? To continue then from 205. All this finds itself overwhelmed in a new destiny with the despotic machine and imperial representation. In the first place, graphism aligns itself on the voice, falls back on the voice, and becomes writing. At the same time, it induces the voice no longer as the voice of alliance, but as that of a new alliance, a fictitious voice from beyond that expresses itself in the flow of writing as direct filiation. These two fundamental despotic categories are also the movement of graphism that, at one and the same time, subordinates itself to the voice in order to subordinate the voice and supplant it. Then there occurs a crushing of the magic triangle. The voice no longer sings but dictates, decrees. The graphy no longer dances. It ceases to animate bodies but is set into writing on tablets, stones, and books. The eye sets itself to reading. Writing does not entail but implies a kind of blindness, a loss of vision, and of the ability to appraise. It is now the eye that suffers, although it also acquires other functions. Or rather, we are unable to say that the magic triangle is completely crushed. It subsists as a base, as a brick, insofar as the territorial machine continues to function in the framework of the new machine. The triangle has become the base for the pyramid, all of whose sides cause the vocal, the graphic, and the visual to converge towards the immanent unity of the despot. If we call the order of representation in a social system a plane of consistency, it is evident that this plane has changed, that it has become a plane of subordination and no longer one of connotation. And here, in the second place, is the essential. The flattening of the graphe onto the voice has made a transcendent object jump outside the chain, a mute voice on which the whole chain now seems to depend, and in relation to which it becomes linearized. The subordination of graphism to the voice induces a fictitious voice from on high which, inversely, no longer expresses itself except through the writing signs that it emits. Revelation. This is perhaps the first assembling of formal operations that will lead to Oedipus, the paralogism of extrapolation, a flattening out or a set of biunivocal relations that leads to the breakaway and elevation of a detached object, and the linearization of the chain that derives from this object. It's just jumping straight fucking in, aren't we? So where do we even begin? Up to this point, just in the previous paragraphs, they had been spending some time talking through the three sides of the magic triangle: voice audition, graphism body, and eye pain. We had talked through the territorial machine with this. Voice being that of the spoken word, the stories we tell. Graphism being things not necessarily related to words, but stories told through recording, through etching. And the eye, which is able to witness the pain, especially etched in bodies through scarification or these pre-created debts through these various ceremonies, the eye witnessing the pain, taking it in and being that thing that confirms it and that participation. These three elements are part of that territorial machine that exists when we don't have power structures, when we don't have economy, when we live in that primitive socius, the earth. At this point, when we've moved towards the despot, these elements have changed significantly. Now, the parts are all still there, but the machine organizes them differently and thus produces a different type of subjectivity, a different type of desire production. The first one they go over here is that the graphism, the writing, aligns itself on the voice. It falls back on the voice and becomes writing. There's a significant difference between cave paintings, which are not linear. For example, there's a lot of ancient cave paintings that are the opposite of that. They go in many different directions and your eye can kind of trace it wherever it goes. That's classic graphism as they're describing it. When we move to writing, it's linearized. Now I have an order of the symbols and they go in this direction and this is the style, this is the thing. Graphism aligns itself in the voice. Suddenly the way I speak and the way I write ultimately talk the same thing. But the difficulty here is that as it talks about it, the voice itself shifts when it becomes writing. Suddenly writing itself by sort of serving the voice. We think of it when we write, and I'm reading words right now or you're reading this page after me. As we read through these words, you think of it as, oh, someone talking and speaking to you. It feels like maybe the writing is serving the voice, but the reality is the opposite. Whereas voice was free and spoken in many ways, now we have married it to graphism. Now it's linearized. And when that happens, the voice is no longer the voice of alliance. It's no longer the stories I tell sort of in a large group, but instead the flow of writing becomes direct filiation. The things that came before me, the lineage that I have, my direct filiation to the despot, the writing, the words have meaning. Particular words have particular meanings. Dictionaries exist. Edicts from on high. This change to graphism, this change to writing is a significant shift to Deleuze and Guattari. And that change in and of itself is a major shift from the territorial to the despotic. That's the first thing I want to go over. I don't think I'm wrong in any of that. I may have over-explained it. Ben, webcam, anyone? Am I off with that? Anything to add?
I mean, that sounded fine to me. I guess this despotic relationship is mirroring the Oedipal relation to the Phallus described prior. Is probably worth noting. The four types of the unconscious, Guattari calls this black hole subjectivation, because a particular signified, we might call it the transcendent signified or whatever, becomes like the singularity point, right, that everything leads towards.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to that because it's I mean, God, I kind of want to talk about it now. Fuck it. This thing that happens, and they talk about it pretty clearly here. The flattening of the graphy onto the voice makes this transcendent object jump outside the chain. This is the phallus inside of the Oedipal triangle. I'm right on that, right, webcam?
Yeah, I mean that's like one of the things that happen at least.
The essence here, as they say, the subordination of graphism to the voice induces a fictitious voice on high, inversely, that no longer expresses itself except through the writing signs that it emits. We need to be thinking about this again. This is not our form of representation or our socius. So jump back a little bit and think about a slightly different machine where as you read, you're reading God's words on high. You're reading the despot's words on high. We may laugh now when we say, of course, God didn't write the Bible. When people say it's the literal word of God, that's what they mean. This is what they're talking about. the nature of the words being that of God, the despot, of the all-powerful, the Godhead, whatever that may be. And that nature of things always places the signs into the spot of revelation, as they call it. And this is the first sorry, please.
I was just going to say, maybe I'm reaching over here, but at least to me, it certainly reads like they're making a direct commentary on logocentrism, right? Because this is exactly what our grammatology is about, which I know that they reference in this chapter and in chapter 4, with regard to like the history of the speech writing hierarchy, right? They're directly talking about writing becoming subordinate, the graphic, right? The grapheme becoming subordinate to the phoneme. With regards to like what you're saying, and obviously like this lended itself towards like a divine logos, right? Like by speaking about things, this is like the Socratic way, right? By speaking about things, we can come to ultimate truths about the universe. And it's like there's this idea that there's this thing within you or whatever, and when you speak, it's closer to this thing or whatever, this primordial, transcendent thing within you that than writing is. And so writing is seen to serve speech, and when writing is seen to serve speech, it is also seen to serve this divine logos.
Yeah.
There's like a quote from Rousseau. I think he says, I think it's from Rousseau anyway. It says something like, "The Bible is like a very great book, but it is only a book."
Yes, and the switch here when it starts becoming essentially one and the same, like they say that it seems that graphism is subordinate, but actually it changes the vocality and the way voice works, and the voice works to become more linearized, to become more definite, to become written, to add that element of permanence. And then ultimately the I itself changes its position. Now as they've said before, when the I looks at the way graphism is used now in writing, it is actually the thing that is pained, because it is stretching and pushing and trying to do the thing or the elements as it does stuff. So it's a really interesting, I like that.
Well, maybe we can add to that, because writing or the graphic is always perpetually breaking the rules, right? It's always a violence, a type of violence. Even when people don't want it to be, right? So for thousands of years, people were doing this phonocentric thing where the voice was more important than the written word, but the written word always had its took its cake too. And this is something that Saussure was really, really bothered by, and maybe we could say he's like the I here or whatever, because he used to get very frustrated with something being written down and somebody reading it and mispronouncing it, and then the word becoming pronounced that way forever after that, because so many people mispronounced it. And he saw this as a corruption of speech through writing, and kept coming up with new justifications for why that wasn't okay or normal or whatever. It had to constantly be shifted back in, thrown back towards the logos, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and it changes again. I keep going back to the I, because it's one of the things I just love about this entire section. The way that the relationship shifts, because again, in the territorial machine, the voice graphy relation is sealed by the I. It's the element that makes the other two work. It's the one that sort of records the inscription as well. It's part of the recording process. The change to being basically just, it reads the words. It isn't doing anything anymore. The I almost produces nothing. It's just taking in the symbol and passing on, this is the symbol, now brain, why don't you tell me what it means, instead of having that sort of instant, momentary, like imminent connection between what's happening. It's a big shift there towards away from the deep recording in the body with the scarification and the pain. The scene is forever etched in my head. The first time we went through this, I found it so difficult to grasp, and now I'm really just getting attached to the way that the I shifts over time. How we see even how it functions, I think is fascinating as well.
It reminds me of a Batillion thing. I know he talks about the I a lot as well, and suffering from that perspective as well, but I'm not really sure what I would say about it.
It feels like they had to have read the I, because it's absolutely one of Bataille's best pieces, and it feels like it's another reason it's stuck in my head, because I've been on a Bataille kick over the last few months, and the eye is just pain in the eye, and is a thing that has stuck in me because of that, for sure. So yeah, for sure it's in that direction, but it's the other side of it, as you're saying, that, and we'll get into that in the next kind of couple paragraphs, but that writing is no longer like a direct designator. The graphy once was. Graphism was a direct designator. You look at cave drawings, for example. I see there's men there, there's cattle or whatever they're fighting over there, or farms or homes or a war, and there's kind of an instant recognition. And the shift from graphism to writing that changes graphism to something that is subordinated to language yet owning it. Now you actually have this sort of separation between the thing that I'm seeing and the interpretation. Now these things mean something directly. Now I have to figure out what the words are, who's saying it. It changes the entire nature of how it works. And to your point about it being the sort of the phallus that's removed in that triangle, and that sort of extra element, like ultimately there's an absent other that is essentially the despot now, that's always got desire, and all desire comes back to. And so when I look at this new writing system, I need to figure out who's saying it. Obviously it's the God. Well, what does God want? I need to do it, because now there's this deep threat of everything behind all of it, because everything is owed and it's an eternal debt. So it shifts everything to being basically this ridiculously pure power structure. Of like, it just deeply painful power structure to the whole thing. But any last comments? I do want to get to the next paragraph, because I'm kind of jumping ahead, I think. It is perhaps at this juncture that the question, what does it mean, begins to be heard, and that problems of exegesis prevail over problems of use and efficacy. The emperor, the god, what did he mean? In place of segments of the chain that are always detachable, a detached partial object on which the whole chain depends, in place of a polyvocal graphism flush with the real, a biunivocalization forming the transcendent dimension that gives rise to a linearity, in place of non-signifying signs that compose the networks of a territorial chain, a despotic signifier from which all the signs uniformly flow in a deterritorialized flow of writing. Men have even been seen drinking this flow. Andrus Simpleni shows how in certain regions of Senegal, Islam superimposes a plane of subordination on the old plane of connotation of animist values. The divine or prophetic word, written or recited, is the foundation of this universe. A transparence of the animist prayer yields to the opacity of the rigid Arab verse. Speech rigidities into formulas whose power is ensured by the truth of the revelation and not by a symbolic or incantatory efficacy. The Muslim holy man's learning refers to a hierarchy of names, verses, numbers, and corresponding beings, and, if necessary, the verse will be placed in a bottle filled with pure water. The verse will be drunk, one's body will be rubbed with it, and one's hands will be washed with it. Writing, the first deterritorialized flow, drinkable on this account. It flows from the despotic signifier. For what is the signifier in the first instance? What is it in relation to the non-signifying territorial signs? When it jumps outside their chains and superimposes a plane of subordination on the plane of immanent connotation? The signifier is the sign that has become a sign of the sign, the despotic sign having replaced the territorial sign, having crossed the threshold of deterritorialization. The signifier is merely the deterritorialized sign itself. The sign made letter. Desire no longer dares to desire, having become a desire of the despot's desire. The mouth no longer speaks, it drinks the letter. The eye no longer sees, it reads. The body no longer allows itself to be engraved like the earth, but prostrates itself before the engravings of the despot, the region beyond the earth, the new full body. Wonderful piece. It feels like it's almost directly pointed at Lacan's concept of the master signifier as well. talking through kind of how this gets to be made and how signification works essentially inside of this space. For anyone who's joined us in our logic of sense discussions, this is very much the entire idea of how signification operates and utilizes not only its own meaning, but that of manifestation and denotation, who speaks and what they're speaking about, in order to derive meaning and sense. It's a wonderful book, totally worth doing. Check out on YouTube. We have all of our recordings. I just love this paragraph. Anyone want to add things here? Any commentary? Ben, I saw you, you mentioned Robert Graves' The White Goddess, which is phenomenal. Do you want a little bit of commentary there for a moment?
I'm trying to like think of how to describe this without sounding completely insane. Sorry. The the White Goddess is like a bizarro world version of Section 3 of Anti-Oedipus. Like, regardless of how much veracity you lend to the major claim that Robert Graves puts forward about like a single unifying proto-religion or whatever, the much more interesting part is the way that he traces the changes in language, both spoken and written, as different cultures interacted with each other, and how language went from almost being words that meant things to being positions which are occupied within a grammatical system, and how letters went from being things or related to things and like changed to become their own sort of like independent units of production. It's a really interesting book. I would like to read it as a server at some point, but that's a whole different discussion to have at a different time.
No, I mean, it's absolutely worth reading. It reminds me also of, I don't know if you've ever read Daniel Quinn's Ishmael, but there's a significant amount in there that plays towards the same thing. There's a moment when Ishmael says to whoever's reading the book, do you think your dog knows its name? And it goes into kind of that idea of what do you think the dog's answering? Does it have any clue, and why, and how we've derived meaning? It's a wonderful book as well, that direction, but White Goddess is ridiculous. It's a good explanation. You didn't sound too insane at all, I don't think.
Good, because it's very easy to sound insane talking about that book.
So one of the real important things through this paragraph is, as we talk through writing, we talk through meaning, again, logic, sense, recommend it. We open up with the question, what does it mean? Begs to be heard. The emperor, the god, what did he mean? In place of segments of the chain that are always detachable, this partial object, in place of a polyvocal graphism flush with the real, which is what we were talking about before, the way the voice operated or graphism operated. Now we have something new, this new thing floating outside of it, this signifier, and how meaning is derived, how words gain their meaning in this complex new network of meaning rather than being flush with the real. And the thing that matters here is this last bit, the part that's in italics. The signifier is merely the deterritorialized sign itself. The sign made letter. If there is a sentence maybe and a half, that really matters here is that within this paragraph. When we talk about signification and how we speak, the written word very specifically, in order for you to determine at any point what way you should pronounce what thing, we rely on a very complex network of signification and language and all of these elements that, as Webcam mentioned, Derrida very much goes through. I think they expand on this and kind of take a different direction, but very much go into the nature of signification, how language works, how these things operate. The idea of the sign made letter is the shift. We've gone from just being able to talk directly about a thing or have graphism that directly relies on a thing to now the combination of the two where nothing directly means anything. The line here, desire no longer dares to desire, having become a desire of desire. We are now deterritorialized, one removed, the sign made letter. We're no longer directly dealing with the real. Now we are a step or two beyond the new full body, as they phrase the end of this paragraph. Does that make sense to everyone? Please, questions, comments. If you ever have a question, don't hesitate, type it in the chat or unmute yourself. If you can't unmute yourself, please let us know also. We're happy to unmute you as well. But I'll continue. No water will ever cleanse the signifier of its imperial origin, the signifying master or the master signifier. In vain will the signifier be immersed in the immanent system of language, or be used to clear away problems of meaning and signification, or be resolved into the coexistence of phonematic elements, where the signified is no more than the summary of the respective differential values of these elements in relationships among themselves. In vain will the comparison of language to exchange and money be pushed to its furthest point, subjecting language to the paradigms of an active capitalism, for one will never prevent the signifier from reintroducing its transcendence and from bearing witness for a vanished despot who still functions in modern imperialism. Even when it speaks Swiss or American, linguistics manipulates the shadow of Oriental despotism. Ferdinand de Saussure does not merely emphasize the following, that the arbitrariness of language establishes its sovereignty as a servitude or a generalized slavery visited upon the masses. It has also been shown that two dimensions exist side by side in Saussure, the one horizontal, where the signified is reduced to the value of coexisting minimal terms into which the signifier decomposes, but the other vertical, where the signifier is elevated to the concept corresponding to the acoustic image, that is, to the voice, taken in its maximum extension, which recomposes the signifier, value as the opposite of coexisting terms, but also the concept as the opposite of the acoustic image. In short, the signifier appears twice, once in a chain of elements in relation to which the signified is always a signifier for another signifier, and a second time in the detached object on which the whole of the chain depends, and that spreads over the chain the effects of signification. There is no phonological or even phonetic code operating on the signifier in the first sense without an overcoding affected by the signifier itself in the second sense. There is no linguistic field without biunivocal relations, whether between ideographic and phonetic values or between articulations of different levels, monemes and phonemes, that finally ensure the independence of the linearity of the deterritorialized signs. But such a field remains defined by a transcendence, even when one considers this transcendence as an absence or as an empty locus, performing the necessary foldings, levelings, and subordinations, a transcendence whence issues throughout the system the inarticulate material flux in which this transcendent operates, opposes, selects, and combines, the signifier. It is curious, therefore, that one can show so well the servitude of the masses with respect to the minimal elements of the sign within the eminence of language, without showing how the domination is exercised through and in the transcendence of the signifier. There, however, as elsewhere, an irreducible exteriority of conquest asserts itself. For if language does not presuppose conquest, the leveling operations that constitute written language indeed presuppose two inscriptions that do not speak the same language. Two languages, one of masters, the other of slaves. Jean Negrel, never going to pronounce that correctly, describes just such a situation. Quote, "For the Sumerians, a given sign is water. The Sumerians read this sign A, which signifies water in Sumerian. An Akkadian comes along and asks his Sumerian master, 'What is this sign?' The Sumerian replies, 'Oh, that's A.' The Akkadian takes this sign for A, and on this point there is no longer any relationship between the sign and water, which in Akkadian is called mu. I believe that the presence of the Akkadians determined the phoneticization of the writing system, and that the contact of two peoples is almost necessary before the spark of a new writing can spring forth.
Just that there's this weird section of one of Saussures' books, I think what it's called, but in chapter 6, it's like everything, his whole system is completely different, and it's like a break in his work, and Derrida identified this as like two different lines of understanding from his work that, Phallus and Guattari just went over briefly there. With regard to like the separated, everything's folded back into the substance of voice, right? Of the phoneme. And then the other one that's like the chain of signification, where a thing becomes like abstracted away from the thing that it's referring to, entering like a system of graphic representation that he says is arbitrary. He says the connection between each signifier and signified is arbitrary, and Derrida uses this to like fold signifier and signified together and kind of like eliminate the difference, and just say that there's like an interplay of signs in general, which Guattari also does in that same seminar I talked about earlier, the 4 types of the unconscious or whatever, where he sort of goes against Saussure's other notion of like the hierarchical relationship between the signifier and the signified, and instead uses the analogy of a TV, of turning on a TV, which is like, a collection of different assemblages working on each other in a reciprocal way, because the person who's going to go to press a button for the TV, oh god, sorry about that. Some nice thematization there, because depending on what's being shown on the TV, maybe Judge Judy's on the TV, and the person watching the TV doesn't want to watch Judge Judy, and so they press the button, right? The TV affects the assemblage of the TV is affecting them, but at the same time, they also have an effect upon the TV, and so it's not a dominant hierarchical relationship between signifier and signified.
Which also follows logic of sense, I think, as well. The idea of signification is pretty clearly, I don't want to say flat, but there's definitely no hierarchy between them. They derive meaning from each other in a network sort of setup. So when we were getting through logic of sense, we were starting to point out it's like, oh, this must be the point where Guattari was reading and went, because he said logic of sense was like, he fell in love with it at some point. We're like, oh, it must be right around here because it matches Guattari's writing from the same time about this stuff. It's really interesting.
To be fair, I think it can be found in Anti-Oedipus as well, like we're talking about right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the TV, I think, is like the perfect analogy, because the TV is its own assemblage, the remote is its own assemblage, and the person is its own assemblage. And there are a lot of desiring machines and assemblages in the person that have to be there, even though they have nothing to do with the TV or anything like that, just because they're part of the same person.
That's a phenomenal example. Thank you. Actually, makes it even more clear for me. I like that. Questions, comments? I think that was actually a solid explanation of almost both paragraphs, really. But I want to spend a little bit more of time on the last bit here, talking about the nature of language between masters and slaves, the two languages. The example of the Sumerian and the Akkadian, one being the one who's essentially the dominant personality. Oh, what is that? What is that? Oh, well, this is A. Now they have a sign that represents the thing. This is what they're talking about when they start saying that there is these two languages, the signifier that ultimately allows these things to be purely about the writing rather than the direct sort of connection that you might have with the previous machine. It's a really interesting example. I just like. Does everyone grasp it? Everyone cool with it? Does it make sense?
Well, there has to be some sort of Nietzschean reference there, right? With the usage of like the master and slave languages.
I mean, for sure. I think it's also a little bit of early foreshadowing when they start talking about the move towards the sort of imperialist side of things, because right now we're still in, we're moving towards imperialist inscription, but also this is how a demand becomes a sign that's now disconnected for those who are being enslaved. Because we're going to be getting into where we've previously had the discussion, how does Oedipus transfer, for example, a representation to these other places? It's, well, what is that? Oh, here's a representation. Your new ruler who's now in charge, you need to learn these representations, this writing, this letter that now is divorcing and now is your representation of the thing. I've inserted myself deeply. So I think it's also a connection back towards that as well.
Yeah, I guess I can't really think of how it's working here. Maybe they'll make it clear in a second.
In what way? The master slave, you mean?
Yeah, because the only thing I can think of, right, is that, I mean, if we're saying the Akkadian is the master or whatever, sort of imposing
the Akkadian's the slave, for sure here.
The slave?
For sure.
Okay.
The Sumerians, in that relationship, historically they were, well, not directly master-slave, might be an extreme way of putting it. It's not terribly far off. The Sumerians, for sure, being the ones in the hegemonic power structure over them. And so the idea being, the Sumerians, they have water, and they read that sign, and the Akkadian comes along, doesn't have any clue what the fuck the sign is. Like, think of a literal sign that says, water here, drink water, ask for water. They don't know what that language is. They don't speak Sumerian or read it. To them, it would be a different whole symbol that directly means, a different sign that directly means this thing. So when they say, what is that? And they go, oh, this is what? This sign? That's the word water. It's not agua, as you may say to an American, to someone in Mexico. Now they have to understand the word, the sign, that is now removed another step for them. They now have to deal with saying the sign because that's what the ruling class wants. This is the words of the ruling class. So I no longer am able to just directly connect with the actual thing that is water in the real. Now I'm multiple steps removed. And that, as they say, there's no relationship between the sign and water anymore, because now it's the sign between A and mu, not water. Water's not even part of their equation, because now when they have to think, oh, I want to say mu, so I'm saying A, which isn't it. So it's one of the ways that enslavement becomes very powerful, because now signification needs to operate in this completely other place where desire is no longer my desire. It's the desire of, you might say the other, I would say in this case, the despot, the ruling class, the masters. How I read this. Does that make sense, webcam?
Yeah. Are we sure that? Sorry, I'm just still thinking about this Akkadian thing. Surely they're the master, right? They're referring to like the Akkadian Empire when they took over like the whole Mesopotamian area and like enslaved everybody.
I mean, the wording in this example, like probably, but like they're specifically quoting Jean Naguerul, who says the line is, an Akkadian comes along and asks his Sumerian master.
Oh, okay.
So what is Sumerian, Akkadian? What the fuck was their relationship?
Well, they had a complicated relationship over a long time.
Yeah, probably. Jesus. Oh yeah, no.
Like,
oh my God. It's like thousands of years. Yes, this would be. Yeah, this is more complicated. Oh, great. Sargon of Akkad. Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. That's where a certain guy got his name from, unfortunately.
Yes. Who's certainly not a Nazi. Yeah, I think so. Whatever the reality may be, and again, there's some loose facts a lot of places through this book when it comes to actual historicity. But I think in this specific place, they're talking about, like, eschew the ideas. It's the slave saying, what is that? Oh, this is A. I don't even say mu. I don't give them their word. You demand the person say the language that you use, and now their relationship is with the language instead of the thing through you as the master. You become the despot, effectively. The sign is your sign. The language is your language.
Oh, maybe this makes more sense because they had the same. They had a non-phonetic script, right?
Oh,
So the sign was in cuneiform, which you can't pronounce, and so you know the um
oh, it was graphism. It's pure graphism then.
maybe yeah. So but anyway, like the obviously the Acadians come in and says like, what does this sign say? Because he doesn't know what it means, and then you know the Sumerian tells him, but obviously like what he's telling him is just the word in a separate language that is phonetic for what it means that they share, and so then he like imposes his own language on top of it afterwards, right?
And it's interesting. I mean, just straight out of Wikipedia to that point, scholars refer to Sumerian and Akkadian in the third millennium as Sprachtbund because Akkadian gradually replaced Sumerian as the spoken language somewhere around 2000 BC, but Sumerian continued to be used as a sacred, ceremonial, literary, and scientific language in Mesopotamia until the 1st century AD. To go back to the idea and the line they have where it may seem like the written word is subordinate, but ultimately it ends up becoming controlling. I think this is kind of what actually we're talking about. Interesting. So yeah, Sumerian became the written word, even for the Akkadians. That's interesting.
I think it's the first written language in general, unless we count like some logographic scripts from earlier that aren't considered a language by linguists.
Yeah, so if the Akkadians used cuneiform effectively as some type of graphism or written, the fact that Sumerian sort of took that over and now the word replaced the direct sort of connotation. Let's say the idea of cuneiform is that it's like almost a purely weird phonetic like experience. It's you take it in as it's sort of shown to you. It's very difficult to understand. I've never fully grasped it, but like it's a very interesting switch to actually have that.
I mean, it happened in Greece as well, with going from Linear B, which is a non-phonetic script, to ancient Greek, right, which
Really?
was pronounceable, and that's what made philosophy possible, because it meant that you didn't. It's quite hard to learn a script that has no phonetic component. Right, it takes a lot of work to figure out how to write everything down, because you can't be told. Someone can't say this is this word. They have to literally show you, in a time with not really anything much to write on either. That's a bit of a pain, and so scholarly endeavors were pretty rare under Linear B. And then once ancient Greek came in, that's when we get people like Socrates and stuff like that, right? Because it shifted the hierarchical relationship of knowledge from the graphic component to the phonetic component.
Yes. Ultimately marrying graphism as writing. Well, that's a whole bunch of different new shit I have to read now that I've got in my browser. Wonderful. It's great. Any comments or questions for webcam on this wonderful revelation or discussion? Anyone, please? I guess I'll move to the next paragraph. One cannot better show how an operation of biunivocalization organizes itself around a despotic signifier so that a phonetic and alphabetical chain flows from it. Alphabetical writing is not for illiterates, but by illiterates. It goes by way of illiterates, those unconscious workers. The signifier implies a language that overcodes another language, while the other language is completely coded into phonetic elements. And if the unconscious, in fact, includes the topical order of a double inscription, it is not structured like one language, but like two. The signifier does not appear to keep its promise, which is to give us access to a modern and functional understanding of language. The imperialism of the signifier does not take us beyond the question, what does it mean? It is content to bar the question in advance, to render all the answers insufficient by relegating them to the status of a simple signified. It challenges exegesis in the name of recitation, pure textuality, and superior scientificity. like the young palace dogs, too quick to drink the verse water and who never tire of crying. The signifier, you have not reached the signifier, you are still at the level of the signifieds. The signifier is the only thing that gladdens their hearts. But this master signifier remains what it was in ages past, a transcendent stock that distributes lack to all the elements of the chain, something in common for a common absence, the authority that channels all the breaks flows into one and the same locus of one and the same cleavage. The detached object, the phallus and castration, the bar that delivers over all the depressive subjects to the great paranoiac king. O signifier, terrible archaism of the despot, where they still look for the empty tomb, the dead father, and the mystery of the name. And perhaps that is what incites the anger of certain linguists against Lacan, no less than the enthusiasm of his followers, the vigor and the serenity with which Lacan accompanies the signifier back to its source, to its veritable origin, the despotic age, and erects an infernal machine that welds desire to the law, because everything considered, so Lacan thinks, this is indeed the form in which the signifier is in agreement with the unconscious, and the form in which it produces effects of the signified in the unconscious. The signifier as the repressing representation and the new displaced represented that it induces, the famous metaphors and metonymy, all of that constitutes the overcoding and deterritorialized despotic machine. I will just quickly say the footnote, Elizabeth Rudinesco's excellent article on Lacan, which we have in the server somewhere, I'll find it and I'll repost it, where she analyzes the twofold aspect of the analytic signifying chain and the transcendent signifier on which the chain depends. She shows that, in this sense, Lacan's theory should be interpreted less as a linguistic conception of the unconscious than as a critique of linguistics in the name of the unconscious. There's so many directions we could take this paragraph. Ken, I mean, you had to know I was going to, webcam parrot too, if you want to jump in, but I was totally have to annoy Ken here because Lacan, man.
Can you hear me all right?
There you are.
I don't know what to say. I mean, it's highlighting a specific time of Lacan, right? He ends up moving away from the signifier and going towards this jouissance, right? And maybe that's the double articulation they're talking about, but I don't think so. The issue with the master signifier, as I understand it, is that there is no like Archimedean point with which you can like understand significant, like you can't signify signification itself. And so there's a lack of a binary signifier. And so like any sort of master signifier that I use to organize knowledge, whether that be science or hermeneutics or any of this stuff where there's like a whole slew of different interpretations of what it is and whatnot, and eventually someone just comes around and says this is this because I say so. Any end to that is arbitrary, and that's called like a quilting point, where you just join an arbitrary signified to the signifier. So science means method or something like that. But Jouissance's enjoyment is what glues that together, is how he suggests it. So it's not necessarily that the signifier is transcendent and organizes all of knowledge. He suggests that it's this like this pleasure and pain almost, or like excessive bodily excitation that makes signification meaningful. So I don't know. I'm not sure how to take this part at all.
I mean, there's also like a weird thing with late Lacan, right? Where a lot of his work starts to look more like what Guattari was writing at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming that they're talking about like early Lacan. And I know some people say about him that he flips the typical Saussurean linguistic motion of the signified being more important, right? For Lacan, it's about signification itself. It's about the signifier rather than the signified often.
Yeah, and he says something I don't quite understand. He suggests the signifier falls into the signified, and y'all were talking about um, Derrida saying like folding them together, and I don't know. That was interesting to me, but I don't know quite what that means.
He like flattens them out so there isn't, because he draws from, I think Saussure says it in one of his texts where he's talking about the given signifier's relationship to its signified is arbitrary, right? And they kind of gave an example of that earlier, like the sign and the two people talking about the sign. And so Derrida flattens it. Instead of there being like this two planes, it's one plane. There is no signifier and signified. There are just signs that interrelate and affect each other. There isn't like the word tree doesn't, for Derrida at least, maybe I shouldn't talk about this too much, but for Derrida at least, the word tree doesn't represent a tree. It is just the word tree, and it's different from a tree and has a relationship to an actual tree, but it doesn't stand for a tree. It stands in for a tree.
Mm-hmm. For sure, that makes sense.
Well, and I don't feel that Deleuze and them would, that G&G in this, I don't think are straying terribly far from that. They're pointing at the idea directly that we now have representation, which I think Derrida would agree with, that the word tree represents a tree, but it represents really the word, and now we're multiple stages sort of separated from it. And that's, I think, where they're starting to connect that with Lacan as they flatten the signifier and the system overall. They go back to, as they do directly just in this, as they're talking about Lacan, getting back to the concept of the master signifier as an idea, or that thing that sort of bestows meaning on the chain of signification. It feels like this is one of those places, and there's not a lot in here, where they're straight praising Lacan and saying, excellent, you figured this out. This is the element. I mean, you didn't go far enough, which is their whole thing kind of all the time. But ultimately, like this element where it welds desire to the law, which is what a lot of the master signifier does, and its sort of place inside of those things. That's super Lacanian. Am I far off there, Ken?
No, not at all. But this part where you're saying it bestows meaning, it doesn't. It does, but it doesn't. It masquerades as being meaningful. It has no meaning.
I'm not saying necessarily a master signifier. I think I'm in agreement generally. I think the essence of the master signifier is empty. They talk about that earlier, and then this thing that it does though is by existing. When I say bestows, without the master signifier, the chain doesn't come together. There's no greater meaning. It's important, especially for the despot, in this way that they're talking about it, that the despot bestows meaning because, in logic sense, Deleuze would say that the manifestation is coming from that of the despot, and that's the sort of second part of signification that's important here. And here, how they're phrasing it is that the signifier goes back to its source, its variable origin, the despotic age, and erects an infernal machine that welds desire to law, because, everything considered, this is indeed the form in which the signifier is in agreement with the unconscious, and the form in which it produces effects of the signified in the unconscious. And this is where they're going back to their version of how the unconscious operates, rather than, meaning being sort of, taken out in this unconscious play of symbols that are rattling around inside of your head. Instead, as they go right into, this signifier now becomes the repressing representation. I mean, we're now talking about how Oedipus is created. The repressing representation and the displaced represented that it induces. The way desire gets trapped, the actual representation that gets put into my unconscious that doesn't really belong there, but I've got to sort of reshape my desire to fit it, because I can't just fucking want water. I have to want A. Now I want A, but I don't want A. No one wants A. They just want to have a drink of fucking good water. And now I can't even tell you what I want, because I have to use these fucking representations to do it. So I'm fucked. So for me to want water, what does water mean? Well, here's what it means according to the despot. And this changes, this master signification changes how this works. And now the unconscious is completely fucked inside of how signification operates inside of it. Specifically the repressing representation and the displaced represented finally show up. We didn't really have that in the territorial socius. Now we're able to see how it's produced through this massive understanding and sort of redraw of Lacanian signification through Derrida almost. It's a very strange combination.
Well, I think everything you just said is just literally Lacan, right? Petit objet à jouissance, you know, the desire for the real that you can never fill in or whatever. So they're kind of saying Lacan is despotic, which I mean, he said, you know, I will become your new master or whatever. Maybe not too unfair of a proclamation about Lacan there. In that this despotic relationship is artificial in a way, right? Because obviously they don't think of desire as a lack, but this here like recodifies things to make it seem like it is.
I mean, one of the major differences is right there with that lack. So, like, you know, where are obstacles in Deleuze and Guattari? Like clearly lack is an obstacle, and I guess psychoanalysis is an obstacle too, or maybe clinging to psychoanalysis is an obstacle. But for Lacan, the obstacle to one's desire retroactively creates the thing desired. And that's like the concept of lack. And so Zizek has that whole thing about, he's actually talking about his wife here, but about like this woman who comes up to him and says, you know, if I only could lose 2 kilos, I would have a perfect body. And then he makes the point that like, no, that those 2 kilos are the thing. It is the thing that gives the illusion of any sort of possible perfection or something beyond normality. If you lost those 2 kilos, you would just have a normal body. So, but Deleuze and Guattari don't seem to be thinking like that at all. And I'm not sure what to make of that.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say they're not saying at all. I would hesitate with. I think to them, a lot of this, it feels like, as Webb compared, this is straight Lacan to a point. And I think to the point is right where they, at the end, make that right comment. So Lacan thinks this is indeed the form in which the signifier is in agreement with the unconscious and the form in which it produces effects of the signified in the unconscious. That's absolutely pure spot on Lacan. Like, boom. The next step, though, is where I think their critique comes in when they start talking about the paralogism of displacement or lack, which is right, as you guys keep talking about, this is where lack is produced inside of this. The paralogism of displacement, which is where we have the repressing representation and displaced represented show up for the first time. And as they're talking through it, instead of, and again, Ken, you and Webcam totally know Lacan more than me, so correct me. For Lacan, it kind of stops here. I know there's a lot more process, but I mean, as far as like getting more granular, there's not another process that generates this, that lack is these elements. This is how the symbolic works. This is how the signifieds play with each other. This is boom, we're done. The next sentence after that, they go into back to the unconscious, the signifier here as repressing representation. They go right into how it actually operates to produce lack, because it does. Lack is produced here. It's not just something that exists or is generated sort of out of its own whole, but instead something that is produced through the signifier and signified. And ultimately the referent is desire itself in the form it takes operating beneath the system of representation. By having representation in this setup, we're producing it. And they've sort of talked machinically about how that happens earlier in the paralogisms. That's to me, that's the next step that they're taking, is that critique and then moving on from there.
I can't really say because I haven't gotten into like I haven't gotten past seminar 20. But you know, I can say that Lacan says in seminar 10 that lack is a symbolic thing. Without the symbolic, without the signifier, there is no lack in the real. But I don't know what he then does.
The real is what completes you, right? And that's this whole point with like the petit objet are, but because you enter into a chain of signification, you can never get it.
Well, now, I mean, you sort of can, but you might have some sort of like psychosis or something, I think is the threat. But the real is the impasse.
Traumatic, yeah.
The real is the impasse of the symbolic and the imaginary, right? So the real is what the symbolic cannot formalize and what the imaginary cannot identify with. But I think that's where I stop. I don't really know much more beyond of the workings of the real.
I do agree that what the main thrust of what they described here is also the main thrust of Lacan's work, kind of generalized, right? And they're saying that this is operating within a wider system that, Lacan doesn't talk about with regards to what the question Brooks was asking. That they're kind of going over Lacan's head here or whatever, or surrounding him.
Yeah, and
with their own formation of how that would happen.
And the big important thing to take away from this, purely for the book, because Jesus Christ, I would love to have a larger discussion around all of this, because it's fascinating to watch how these things intertwine so much. Very particularly, we're getting back to how representation works. As we talked about, if we want to go over the entire history of this book, chapter 1 is ultimately about how things work in our head. Chapter 2 is about how our head gets fucked up and the systems. And then chapter 3, we're talking about social production. We're talking about the molar versus the molecular. And as we talked about with the molecular inside of the unconscious, how, we have these paralogisms, we have the 3 passive syntheses that generate ourselves and recordings and all this stuff. Here is this next part, because when we talked about Oedipus, and one of the things I know a lot of people had trouble with, I did for sure my first time through this, is how does this relate back? And when we talked about Oedipus and we talked about how Oedipus sort of comes to play in, they went through the critique of representation, which is the paralogism of displacement or lack. And the way that works, and it was tough to understand at the time, is we had these kind of elements. First, we have the signifier of the prohibition. We have incest. And I say, oh, no, incest. Ooh. And it generates, when I do that, it generates a corresponding signified. The signified is a distorted image of desire that is produced by the representation itself. Now, that part is really fucking tough to understand. But they're coming back to it here because we're starting to talk about water and A versus mu. We're talking about how we come to call things what we call them, how signification works. And through all of this, they're driving right back at Lacan and talking through what he totally grasped, which is, hey, this shit comes from on high. There's a master slave almost dialectic to this. And we need to talk through how meaning and representation gets pushed into the person. And this is how. We have a written word called incest. We didn't have that in the territorial times. That's why they talked about that in the classic first territorial, the earth socius. People can't commit incest. Of course, a kid can fuck his mom, fuck his sister, dad, like all kinds of awful shit. Like cannibalism, all kinds of weird shit happens. But they didn't call it that because there's no representation. So the prohibition of incest, that nature is the signifier of prohibition that generates the signified, the written word, the thing that it is. Now we have this representation that's produced, which is in this case, the Oedipus complex. I have the Oedipus complex. I have this thing that's pure representation. You don't have shit, but you have to call it something. And ultimately what happens is this element of desire, because you have desire pumping all the time, it just kind of has to operate beneath this prohibitive system of representation, and it gets just fills and pushed underneath. Refoulement is the word they used because it's also the word used for backed up toilets and exploding flows. I think This is what they're coming back around to, is to say, here is actually how representation starts getting fucked up. And the first thing is we have the written word, which means words mean things. Now we have signification. Now we have representation, and here's where it goes wrong. That's the big sort of coming back all the way around. This is that moment where they're like, Lacan's spot on, now we're going to take it further. And I'm going to take it right to the next paragraph to continue that as well, unless anyone has any comments on what I just said. The despotic signifier has the effect of overcoding the territorial chain. The signified, oh, webcam, go for it. You want to talk about the alphabetic thing? Go for it.
Well, at the beginning there.
Yeah, the Hegel line, right?
Yeah, because Hegel thinks that alphabetic writing is like the best because it's the closest to speech. And the things like cuneiforms are like barbaric forms of writing, right? Because they're graphical. But the sort of thing, and it's not just him, but like he's like the main one that talks about alphabetic writing all the time. Obviously, reading alphabetic writing is not reading at all. Because you're reading a phonetic script, so you don't actually know how to read, and that's why they say that knowing like alphabetic writing is for the illiterate. So they're making fun of Hegel and saying he's illiterate because he doesn't understand the graphic sign. And it messes with this whole idea. Like, so for Hegel, everything has to happen over time, but graphic representation doesn't have a temporality, right? It's just, like if you look at a painting, like what's the time frame of the painting? Like, it doesn't have a time frame. The actual content has no time frame, right? Unlike a sentence in phonetic script.
Especially one that's hyperlinearized.
Yeah. Like alphabetic writing, yeah.
Oh, like alphabetic writing, yeah. It goes
No
by way of illiterates, those unconscious workers, which it's such a great little phrase that they have there.
Anyway, go ahead. I just wanted to mention that.
No, it's great. Anytime we can shit on Hegel, I'm happy to. To continue. The despotic signifier has the effect of overcoding the territorial chain. The signified is precisely the effect of the signifier, and not what it represents or what it designates. The signified is the sister of the borders and of the mother of the interior. Sister and mother are the concepts that correspond to the great acoustic image, to the voice of the new alliance and direct filiation. Incest is the very operation of overcoding at the two ends of the chain in all the territory ruled by the despot, from the borders to the center. All the debts of alliance are converted into the infinite debt of the new alliance, and all the extended filiations are subsumed by direct filiation. Incest, or the royal trinity, is therefore the whole of the repressing representation insofar as it initiates the overcoding. The system of subordination or signification has replaced the system of connotation. To the extent that graphism is flattened onto the voice, the graphism that not so long ago was inscribed flush with the body representation subordinates itself to word representation. Sister and mother are the voices signifieds. But to the extent that this flattening induces a fictitious voice from on high that no longer expresses itself except in the linear flux, the despot himself is the signifier of the voice that, along with the two signifieds, affects the overcoding of the whole chain. What made incest impossible, namely that at times we had the appellations, mother-sister, but not the persons or the bodies, while at other times we had the bodies, but the appellations disappeared from view as soon as we broke through the prohibitions they bore, has ceased to exist. Incest has become possible in the wedding of the kinship bodies and family appellations, in the union of the signifier with its signifieds. The much better put version of the ramble I had there at the very end. We're coming back around to how representation ultimately produces this problem and this paralogism of representation and how it works, how incest comes to be, Oedipus comes to be, and how representation starts constraining how desire moves. There is a comment there, Vivian, you're right, with the appellations. I have a feeling they don't mean Appalachia. My family's from West Virginia, although maybe it's a brilliant, ahead of its time joke about incest. Entirely possible. It's a hell of a long pull for that one, but yeah, why not? The West Virginia Appalachians are very famous for incest, for anyone not in America. Just mentioning. Please, questions or comments before I move on, because we're about to move out into how these things sort of grow a little bit further, getting a little bit more complex into it. At this point, please, I'll take a moment. If anyone has questions or comments, now would be the time.
I have a question that is, generally open to those that have, grappled with the text for a longer time. But just generally speaking, their usage of incest here is very specific, although, of course, they're in conversation with like kinship and how anthropology has approached kinship as a whole system of significations. But this is very poetic in a certain way, but also speaking outside of purview of the study of kinship itself, at least as it has been done in ethnology, or as it was being done in ethnology in the 70s and the 80s when they were writing this. So just in general, like, how would you understand their application of the concept of incest here?
Maybe I'm not understanding the question well enough. In what way do you mean?
So they're definitely not talking directly, it seems to me that they're not directly talking about practices of incest and the prohibition of incest in the context of primitive societies, or in the so-called incest taboo that
I believe they are
a predicate.
I believe they are as well. So there were incest taboos, and they're not saying that there was no incest. This is where this starts to get fun. Let's say right now, my son's 3, and he calls my wife mommy. It's his mom. If I were to say that in China there's no mommy, no, it's true. I as far as I'm aware, it's not the word they really use. They have mama, baba, lots of different other words depending on the locations within different countries. That representation's not a thing. Now, if we go back in time, there is parents fucked kids, kids fucked parents, siblings fucked. All this shit's happened. Like, they're not saying that it's never the case. This has never happened. Specifically, though, they're talking about how Oedipus and incest as we know it comes to form, this incest prohibition, or specifically the Oedipal triangle, how we get to the point where we believe it is something that is so determinant in the human condition. And so when they go back, Freud, for example, the book's escaping my brain because I'm dumb right now. Freud spent some time and he went, oh, look, all these old places, and a lot of people since, ethnologists as well. Oh, look, all these places have taboos on incest. It means that everyone must be Oedipalized in order to be part of a good world and to be good in society, to be, fitting in. And a lot of ethnologists went this direction. The question would be, why do they prohibit incest? And do they prohibit it in the same way that we do? And this is, I think, their core argument, is that it's not the same as us saying, look, there's just a general incest prohibition. Well, why? Because things, morals or whatever. They had other reasons. To go back to when they talked about desire being flush with the real. Like, you didn't fuck your mom inside of those societies, not because there was an incest prohibition per se, but because your job was to go out and marry other women to expand your family's reach and alliances. You didn't fuck your sister because your sister was essentially, stock mule, and you need to trade her and marry into other families. The same way that a hunter didn't have a prohibition of killing and eating and cooking the meat before he came back to the camp. He wouldn't do that, not because there's some prohibition against it. And they said, hunters aren't allowed to do this. Never eat your own kill. It's just because it doesn't work that way. Their affiliations and alliances determine the organization of their production and where their desires sit. So they never really had these, things. That shit happened. Obviously things happened, but they weren't prohibited in the same way through representation as we have it. So now when I approach someone who's never known mommy, who's never known incest, who doesn't like doesn't know these things as representations. And I say, cool, here's 20 things that aren't allowed. Here's a Bible. There you go. The way that it works on their unconscious is through representation. When, okay, so wait, I want that. What is that? Well, this is incest. This is a prohibition. It's like, oh, the moment that happens, that signifier, which exists in the written word. What is that? That's water. That's not what we say. It's what's that? Well, this is incest. It creates and generates its own corresponding signified. And it does this within the unconscious, within the sort of the nature of experience, within the three syntheses. And with that, we have this distorted image of desire now that is produced by the representation itself, which is the case of the Oedipus complex, or this fucked up sort of displaced represented. And underneath all of that, desire is still pulsing towards these things, because basically they learn at the moment the thing they know they now can't have. And this process is the difference that they're trying to get back to and have us understand that this is through representation this happens, not through some societal norms, or that it's determinate or whatever, that I tell people, oh, you can't fuck your mom. It's like, oh shit, okay. It's like the nature of issuing the edict through representation creates these problems, because the nature of the signified doesn't touch desire and doesn't allow desire to meet the real, as they phrase it. Is that a better explanation, Goering?
Yeah, I get what you mean. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, it's a long journey. If anyone wants to add to that, please. To Rimka's question, expanding on the signified is this sentence, the signified is precisely the effect of the signifier and not what it represents or designates. To go back to, I mean, webcam is going to be so angry with me. It feels like this is kind of pointing at the same kind of thing that Derrida would say, that the word tree isn't representing a tree. It's a word that represents the word tree. Now we can associate that with tree. Yeah, here we should take a step back and we have the signified and the signifier. The signifier generates the signified within the unconscious. It is the thing that sort of creates that. I'm not directly dealing with at any point water or incest or these other elements. It is not what it represents or designates. Instead, the signifier generates a signified, not direct connection, which graphism or voice prior to this would have. That probably is butchering Derrida. I'm very sorry, everybody. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, phew. Webcam parrot. Later in this book, they cite of grammatology and basically just say Derrida is right about language, so it's not unfair. They do say that, and I love Derrida's take on language, so it does help. Does that help, Remka, as I move down the questions? Awesome. Sven, so it's like when people figured out they haven't been to the moon, they started wanting to go there. It's Truman, a Truman Show, learning that there is more outside. It's the world that you live in doesn't have these representations or these things. You go about your day and you don't think about it. When I introduce it, the nature of introducing this introduces all these other things. One of the things Derrida says that I've always loved is, I think Lacan says it too, Derrida, maybe just Derrida, you can't be partially into language. You've either joined language or not. Like that's it. You can't be sort of into like, oh, I kind of speak English. No, you're in the world of language or not. It's a whole difficult thing there. So it's not so much that like, oh, we should go to the moon. It's more when I write the word moon versus seeing it and just experiencing it. Once I've written the word moon, now it's a thing. Once I've done the thing, that generates its secondary signified. And now I'm desiring the displaced represented rather than the thing itself. And this is what happens with incest. This is what happens with cannibalism or any type of perversion. This is how these things affect us with lack and these other elements. Hope that answers, Sven. Rocket test. So that means there's a meta language we're not aware of, or the language we use is meta. Oh, that's actually a really good way to think through it. baked into language is meta language, I think would be an answer I'd give. Webcam?
Well, I would more so say the problem is that language never completes itself, right? Because it always defers to more language.
Ooh, I like that.
So there's actually no point where we can have a meta language because it would just be more language.
No, that's a fair way to put it. It's language is eternally incomplete. And that's, I think, a thing Lacan for sure agrees with, and I think Derrida too. And so the nature of language as people deal with the signifier and the signifieds, I think D&G would even go there and say, like, we can't be satisfied with the signified. That's not how it works, because now we're dealing with the representation of representation. We desire someone else's desire, which is like a classic psychoanalytic trope. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that flows nicely. Please let me become Jesse is a painting of the moon language. No. No. Graphism married with language in writing is language. I don't think here. All right, webcam parrot, please, if you would answer. You have a better answer than I do. I think he's just typing. There are two words for language in French. In one of them, yes, it would be langue is like French, English, the literal languages. Langage is language in general, which is spoken. Yeah, fair. Okay. I think to D&G, especially to Deleuze, the answer would be no. The words and the way he talks of language, specifically in logic of sense, difference and repetition, and then the way he goes on to talk about art and diagrammatics inside of logic of sensation, the Francis Bacon book, I think he's very clear in how representation, specifically he's talking about language with representation at the center of it, rather than language being the general way people communicate as a specific thing. Because there's language in the sense that, like, that general sense of, yes, we communicate through things, and there's a language to paintings, there's a language to video games, there's a language to television. Those elements, I don't think he would say are language in the way that we're talking about it here, specifically. There's diagrammatics and a few other things. It's a type of language, but just not in the phrasing we're talking about. We're being specific here to the way I'm talking, the way you read words, and how we find signification through that. Does that make sense, webcam? Anyone else? Is that a fair thing before I move on?
To be fair, I think Deleuze frequently uses not long gauge in logic of sense anyway.
Yeah, he does. I'm sure I anglicize it long. He's for sure talking about that. He's actually very clear, especially in again, logic of sensation, when he talks about the language or the diagrammatics of paintings, using Francis Bacon as the example throughout the book. Like, there is a language to that, for sure. He believes in that. It's just, we're talking here about signification specifically.
Yeah, here they're definitely not talking about long gauge.
Yeah, we're talking about the way that the graphism has shifted to words and how words become themselves despotic. Vivian says, kind of jumping in after being away from the text for a while, but does the DBM introduce global persons, or were those involved in the PTM as well? DBM. God damn it, I'm stupid.
Yeah, can you elaborate on what DBM is?
Despotic barbarian machine, and the other one would be primitive territorial machine. Yeah, global persons, whole persons or global persons are a thing that don't really exist outside of language in the same way. It's a part of representation. Whole persons exist, but not global in the same way. I don't have a mom, for example, inside of just voice or inside of that sort of the territorial machine and how it worked. I still have a mom. Like, I have that person that I could call mom. I just don't have a word for the genericized mommy. This is mom or whatever. Still have a mom. There's still someone who gave birth to me, but I'm taken care of in a vast network of people. And even if it's like this poor one woman, single mother in the primitive machine, I still wouldn't call her mom. I don't have a mom that's like a global mom in the same way. J.K. mentions in Logic of Sense, 5th series on sense and the 4 paradoxes of regress and indefinite proliferation in the uses of language. I think I was at hence by it is by no means, so I'll continue from there. Hence, it is by no means a question of knowing if the despot marries his true sister or his true mother, for in any case, his true sister is the sister of the wilderness, just as his true mother is the mother of the tribe. Once incest is possible, it matters little whether it is simulated or not, since in any case, something else again is simulated through incest, and in accordance with the complementarity of simulation and identity that we encountered earlier, if the identification is that of the object on high, the simulation is indeed the writing that corresponds to it, the flux that flows from this object, the graphic flux that flows from the voice. Simulation does not replace reality. It is not an equivalent that stands for reality, but rather it appropriates reality in the operation of despotic overcoding. It produces reality on a new full body that replaces the earth. It expresses the appropriation and production of the real by a quasi-cause. In incest, it is the signifier that makes love with the signifieds. System of simulation is the other name for signification and subordination. And what is simulated and therefore produced through the incest that is itself simulated and therefore produced, all the more real for being simulated and vice versa, is something very much like the extreme states of a reconstituted, recreated intensity. With his sister, the despot simulates a zero state from which the phallic force will arrive, like a promise, whose hidden presence in the very interior of the body must be situated at the extreme limit. And with his mother, the despot simulates a superforce where the two sexes would be at the maximum degree of externalization of their specific natures, the BA of the phallus as voice. So to go back to someone was asking about incest and how this works, and because I think it was Gehring, this is not a question of whether or not the despot marries his true sister. By true sister, they mean biological or whatever, like who we would call a sister, or his true mother. It doesn't even matter. It's that once incest is possible, it matters little whether it is simulated or not, since in any case, something else again is simulated through incest. We're now in this place of representation where thing means thing means thing means thing. We're past the direct connection. We've stepped into this new wild frontier where everything's overcoded despotically. I'll leave it open for a second, but I'm also happy to dive forward to the next paragraphs because we get into bisexuality and homosexuality and all kinds of fun stuff. All right. Hence, something else is always at issue in royal incest. Bisexuality, homosexuality, castration, transvestism has so many gradients and passages in the cycle of intensities. This is because the despotic signifier aims at the reconstitution of the full body of the intense earth that the primitive machine had repressed, but on new foundations or under new conditions present in the deterritorialized full body of the despot himself. This is the reason that incest changes its meaning or locus and becomes the repressing representation. For what is at stake in the overcoding affected by incest is the following: that all the organs of all the subjects, all the eyes, all the mouths, all the penises, all the vaginas, all the ears, and all the anuses become attached to the full body of the despot, as though to a peacock's tail of a royal train, and that they have in this body their own intensive representatives. Royal incest is inseparable from the intense multiplication of organs and their inscription on the new full body. Sod saw clearly this always royal role of incest. The apparatus of social repression, psychic repression, i.e. the repressing representation, now finds itself defined in terms of supreme danger that expresses the representative on which it bears, the danger that a single organ might flow outside the despotic body, that it might break away or escape. Suddenly the despot sees rising up before him, against him, the enemy who brings death, an eye with too steady a look, a mouth with too unfamiliar a smile. Each organ is a possible protest. It is at one and the same time that a half-deaf Caesar complains of an ear that no longer hears, and sees weighing on him the look of Cassius, lean and hungry, and the smile of Cassius, who smiles in such a sort as if he mocked himself. A long chronicle that will carry the assassinated, dismembered, disorganized, filed-down body of the despot into the latrines of the city. Wasn't it already the anus that detached the object on high and produced the immanent voice? Didn't the transcendence of the phallus depend on the anus? But the latter is revealed only at the end, as the last vestige of the vanished despot, the underside of his voice. The despot is nothing more than this dead rat's ass suspended from the ceiling of the sky. The organs begin by detaching themselves from the despotic body, the organs of the citizen risen up against the tyrant. Then they will become those of private man. They will become privatized after the model and memory of the disgraced anus, ejected from the social field, the obsessive fear of smelling bad. The entire history of primitive coding, of despotic overcoding, and of the decoding of private man turns on these movements of flows. The intense germinal influx, the surflux of royal incest, and the reflux of excrement that conducts the dead despot to the latrines and conducts us all to today's private man. The history sketched out by Artaud in his masterpiece Heliogabal. I'll never pronounce that correctly. The entire history of the graphic flux goes from the flood of sperm in the tyrant's cradle to the wave of shit in his sewer tomb. All writing is so much pig shit. All writing is this simulation, sperm, and excrement. Sometimes it's very fucking poetic. I just love it. I'll leave it open if anyone wants to say something. I'm good with awkward silences. I make the joke often, but I'm happy to just sit here for a moment. Is there a specific text re-smelling bad, or is that a general statement? I think it's a comment about assholes. I just think it's a comment about how assholes smell bad. Am I wrong? Maybe there's a specific text, because I know later on they're specifically referencing Artaud's play to a done with the body of God, but I do think that's specifically their sort of joke. It's hard to tell sometimes, but it's the analogy of private man, the disgraced anus ejected from the social field, sharing the obsessive fear of smelling bad, which I like.
It's safe to assume they're making fun of Freud when they say something about an ass.
That flows. That flows. Rimka asks, question about the previous paragraph. Can we explain the phallus as voice? Ooh. Does anyone want to take a crack at that one? Anyone? I'm happy to do it. Webcam?
I was washing dishes. I'm sorry. I don't know what I'm supposed to talk about.
That's okay. So the final line here, let me find the specific source that it's coming from. The final line of the previous paragraph is, with his sister, the despot simulates a zero state from which the phallic force will arise, like a promise, whose hidden presence in the very interior of the body must be situated at the extreme limit. And with his mother, the despot simulates a superforce where the two sexes would be, quote, at the maximum degree of externalization of their specific nature, the BA of the phallus as a voice. That specifically, I don't know what that's a direct reference to. I'm going to check and I'll be right back while Ken talks, hopefully.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sort of confused. I'm not sure what they're talking about. I mean, the phallus is supposed to situate sexual difference, right? So not the difference between man and woman, but sexual difference as such. So it's a difference in itself. And there's this sort of progression between the difference between the image and then the difference between the sort of rules that regulate the image, and then a difference in those rules themselves that is then the real. And then that's sexual difference. And that's sort of kicked off by this, I don't know, dialectic of the phallus.
Yeah, and the reference is to Guy Rosolato, his book Essays of the Symbolic. which doesn't exist in English anywhere, nor can I find anything about him. So we'll have to save that question, perhaps. If anyone wants to try, though, I'm more than happy to listen. One might think that the system of imperial representation was, in spite of everything, milder than that of territorial representation. The signs are no longer inscribed in the flesh itself, but on stones, parchments, pieces of currency, and lists. According to Wittfegel's law of diminishing administrative returns, wide sectors are left semi-autonomous, insofar as they do not compromise the power of the state. The eye no longer extracts a surplus value from the spectacle of suffering. It has ceased to evaluate. It has begun rather to forewarn and keep watch, to see that no surplus value escapes the overcoating of the despotic machine, for all the organs and their functions experience a detachment and elevation that relates them to and makes them converge on the full body of the despot. In point of fact, the regime is not milder. The system of terror has replaced the system of cruelty. The old cruelty persists, especially in the autonomous or quasi-autonomous sectors, but it is now bricked into the state apparatus, which at times organizes it and at other times tolerates or limits it in order to make it serve the ends of the state and to subsume it under the higher superimposed unity of a law that is more terrible. As a matter of fact, the law's opposition or apparent opposition to despotism comes late, when the state presents itself as an apparent peacemaker between classes that become distinct from the state, making it necessary for the latter to reshape its form of sovereignty. Simple, fairly straightforward paragraph. We're no longer in a place of cruelty, and it feels like, oh, things are better. It's like, nope. Now we're in a place of utter terror where, again, previous to this, we would go about our day. Maybe I'd have my skin etched. I'd have my debts clear in front of me. I'd deal with things as I dealt with them. And as they would say, my desires came up sort of directly against the real. Being in a place of representation where things are written and determined and coded, and everything has to be coded. Now it's important that the eye is watching. The eye is taking this in, looking, not taking in cruelty, but instead keeping an eye out for transgressions, because ultimately that's now what we are in. We are in a place of representation. Everything must fit within that. It's how we understand things. It's all we know. Because we're about to move into the law itself and how laws come to be and how the edict against incest comes to be and how, again, social production is organized and moved and how we behave within it. So I will remember right where we left off, but I want to spend, we have another 10 minutes set aside. I have generally a hard stop at 2, but if anyone has questions over everything in this section so far, not just this reading, where are you struggling? Where are you having issues? Where are you wanting definitions? Don't hesitate to ask. We have a few minutes, or we can just have a really fun discussion if someone wants to bring up a thing.
I want to go back to the that last question about the phallus as voice. Is that phallus is a master signifier? Because it is the phallus does represent power and authority, right?
I'm gonna have to I would love to have this discussion. I know I'm gonna end up saying something horribly wrong because I haven't read as Lacan. Difficulty with Lacan, and I think a lot because I think this is coming from Lacan, the use of voice and talking about the phallus's voice and BA. These feel like Lacanian just things. The problem is that Lacan, in the entirety of his career, changed significantly, and I don't have enough of a read on his entire setup. What I can say is that the phallus, the one part I'm fairly, I think I have is that for Lacan, the phallus is a signifier across everything. It's something in the real, it's something in the symbolic, it's also in the imaginary, and this unique reality of it makes it absolutely one of the more powerful master signifiers. How this plays towards voice, I think I could make guesses, but I'd probably be wrong. I may have already been wrong on what I've said, because this is where we get into the really other side of Lacan that I'm not super good at.
I mean, it sort of does regulate what can be said to an extent. Did you have something to say, J.K. Wonder? Sorry if I cut you off.
No, that's a question. It does make sense that the phallus as a voice. Voice is it relates to spoken language, right? So it is in the symbolic order of language, and also in terms of sexuality, the Oedipus complex. Um,
It's a tough one. I know. Like, this is one of those things that I don't know the exact derivation of why they would use the term voice. I actually don't know, and I remember looking this up last time. I could never find B-A ba. Like, fucking someone please point out where that is. Like, it's not in any of Lacan's weird knot diagrams. I couldn't figure out what they were referring to. So there's a lot there. Rocketest asks, doesn't he make the phallus a drive if it has a voice?
That brings up the difference between the signifier and the object A. So you've got these detachable objects. You've got the feces, the gaze, the breast, and the voice. Maybe there's a couple more, but the I guess another. So man is only man in juxtaposition to woman, right? So in order for there to be a man out of sexual difference, it needs this exclusion that is woman, that totalizes whatever man is in some arbitrary way. But at the same time, the exclusion has to be an exclusion. It can't be incorporated into this totality. And so woman for man serves as an object A. And then that's the connection between the phallus as a signifier and the phallus as a partial object.
So just real quick, because it's so the libidinal effects of there's so many things that are like knock-on effects of the phallus. It would be the gaze loss, but voice. Let's assume voice is like an awkward translation here, but like a person's voice and their introduction to language and signification comes through the phallus in Lacan. Like if we assume voice isn't literally spoken word, but instead like the experience of language. Like the gaze and the voice are object petit a. I just what you were saying made me connect to this. So if object petit a is ultimately like the crazy versions, the exemplary versions of them are the gaze and the voice, then that would, like, let's just imagine. I'm just trying to think. Maybe it's just awkwardly worded. That in that way we would be talking about the phallic being very responsible for the voice. Because it's just, we're now talking like 3 steps really to get there. It may just be worded funny.
Yeah, for sure. But he ends up like not really saying phallus much after he does. I can't remember which seminar, but the other side of psychoanalysis, because the phallus contains like very particular. It contains a specific connotation, right? But I still think it's helpful insofar as you can sort of spot the phallic signifier. Anytime you go to a mega church or something, or anytime someone's talking about the invisible hand of the market, That reminds me of the phallus as a master signifier. Um, but essentially, the master signifier is just the ground of signification that is supposedly self-referential, but you can't ever get to it. And the reason why is because it's displaced the real. It's you've gotten language and you've marked on flesh language. And this is why he suggests that lack comes from this symbolic register. Because I mean, what happens anytime you try to investigate one of these, whenever you start to investigate one of these master signifiers, it just ends up being nonsense. It ends up being meaningless. It ends up being a matter of faith, is what, and power and authority, right? But that's not all, and that's why I posted this upaya. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but it's essentially, the wiki says voluntary action driven by an incomplete reasoning. Like you've got to be able to maybe act without being able to know everything. That's the master signifier. Helps with this, right? You can't know everything about it. The centipede can't be able to know on the most molar of levels how all of its legs move. Otherwise, it just fumble all over itself. And the master signifier aids in this as well. So anytime I want to try to do science, do an experiment, I don't need to rehash exactly to the very nth degree what science is, right? I mean, it's nice. And then there's the danger. You get lazy and you start just carrying around this master signifier science that's sort of just a banner for specific activities, but no one really knows what they're doing. And so what is it? What I passed by a quote the other day, and it was something like, Deleuze was saying something like, you need to deserve your life or something like that, and it was in response to like pain or something. Maybe you can clarify that for me, Brooks, if you've heard it.
That doesn't sound like a thing he'd
I
say.
can find it again.
Please do. I'm curious.
But and I think it was like he was pulling from Nietzsche or something. But what is life, right? Can you tell me exactly what life is? I've seen some things.
Are you high? Like, are we having that discussion right now? What's happening?
No, I'm making the point of master signifier. If it's not clear enough.
No, right. I mean, it's the Lacan cheval. What do you want? Like, it's the demand constantly of the other.
Am I high, asshole?
Well, I'm just it just sounded like it's like it was weird. I cut into that discussion and you're like, man, I mean, what is life? And then you're like, what the fuck?
But you get the, so I'm just trying to maybe inject the point that that the master signifier might not be something that you can so easily get out of or get away from, and maybe you don't necessarily want to do that, but you do want to be mindful of its effects.
Well, and I think D&G would drive right at that point, because again, their entire thing is that the signification of meaning, especially in this, but we will come to capital, and it's not drastically different under capital. There is, I'm not talking to the thing that is my object of my desire, but instead it's the object of desire of an object of desire of an object of another. And it's this ridiculous chain that ultimately the master signifier we can't get away from, because it's what determines all of these other elements. And it's why they have this last line where they talk about, they're like, this sounds like it may be good because at least we're not etching in bodies and being brutal. And it's like, no, there's actually a natural terror that comes with that, with this, everything now is ultimately due to or on the shoulders of this despot, this god, this being, this godhead creature who's, oh my God, is the king. He's so powerful. Like everything is due. And therefore, because of that, his desires are all that matter to me, because that's how my desires then become organized through representation. This goes the other way, just like my desires outwards. As I go through the 3 syntheses, my desires get recorded, blah, blah, blah. They move out from the other way, thanks to the way representation works. His desires become mine, and it misshapes my desires through the way, the critique of representation, through the paralogism I brought up earlier. And this sort of setup is incredible when you start piecing it together as like, oh, so this is the kind of stuff that Lacan was talking about when we talked about the master signifier and where this comes on high and how it comes on high. It's, there's a lot there, but again, I think it drives right at just in general what Lacan was talking about. Like my understanding of it, pretty spot on.
Someone's at the door. I gotta be.
All right, cool. Yeah, have fun, Kent. It is also our 2-hour mark. If anyone has any further questions, don't hesitate to write in chat. Hit us up on Twitter, DNGQC. Hit us up on Patreon if you're supporting what we're doing, DGQC. And see us next week, where I actually have marked the page, and we will start properly at exactly noon PST. I hope to see you all there. Thank you very, very much. Oh, that's a lot. Thank all of you for joining so very much.